Frank spread the business cards and flyers across the counter like he was dealing cards. Each piece of paper represented a lifeline that the three young men had never known existed. "Here's how this works," Frank said, his voice taking on the tone of a commanding officer briefing his troops. "I'm going to give you each a different path forward, but there are conditions." Marcus leaned forward, studying the cards. One was for a construction company, another for an electrician's apprenticeship program, and a third for emergency financial assistance. "First condition," Frank continued, "you return that pistol to whoever you borrowed it from, and you never touch another weapon unless you're properly trained." "Marcus, I'm guessing that gun belongs to a family member?" Marcus nodded shamefully. "My cousin Ray, he doesn't even know I took it." "Second condition, you're going to make this right. Not just by walking away tonight, but by proving you can be better than this moment." Tommy picked up a card for a medical billing advocacy service. "What does this mean?" "It means there are people who specialize in negotiating medical bills, finding payment plans, locating charity care programs. Your mother's surgery might be more affordable than you think." Frank pulled out his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts. "My neighbor's wife works for this organization. I'm going to call her tomorrow and tell her to expect a call from Tommy Chen. But you have to follow through." "You'd really do that?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Son, I've learned that most problems that seem impossible actually have solutions. The trick is knowing where to look and having someone point you in the right direction." Jake picked up a flyer for a local charity that helped families dealing with medical emergencies. "My dad's been too proud to ask for help. He keeps saying we can handle it ourselves. Pride's a luxury your family can't afford right now," Frank said bluntly. "I've seen strong men destroy their families because they were too stubborn to accept help when they needed it." Frank reached under the counter and pulled out a worn notebook. "I keep contact information for people in this community who actually get things done. Not bureaucrats or politicians, but people who solve problems." He flipped through several pages covered in neat handwriting. "Jake, there's a man named Robert Chen, no relation to Tommy here, who runs a foundation specifically for families dealing with cancer costs. Lost his own wife to the disease 5 years ago. He'd help us," Jake asked incredulously. "He'd help you navigate the system, find resources you didn't know existed, maybe even provide direct assistance. But you have to call him. You have to ask." Marcus stared at the construction company card. "What about this one?" "Hernandez Construction. Miguel Hernandez is a good man who hires people based on work ethic rather than experience. He's expanded his business every year for the past decade." Frank dialed a number on his phone. To the three young men's amazement, someone answered despite the late hour. "Miguel? It's Frank from the gas station." "Yeah, I know it's late. Listen, I've got a young man here who needs work. Construction experience, good character, just hit a rough patch. Tomorrow morning?" "Perfect." He hung up and looked at Marcus. "You've got an interview at 7 a.m. Don't screw it up." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" "We tried to rob you." "Because I understand desperation," Frank said simply, "and because I've learned that most people are fundamentally good, even when they make terrible decisions." Frank walked around the counter and sat on his stool. "Let me tell you boys about the worst mistake I ever made. I was 22, stationed in Germany. Broke because I'd been sending most of my pay home to help my mother." The three young men listened intently as Frank's voice took on a distant quality. "I got involved with some other soldiers who were selling stolen equipment on the black market. Not weapons, just surplus gear, but it was still theft. We got caught." "What happened?" Tommy asked. "I should have been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. Instead, my commanding officer, Colonel James Peterson, gave me a choice. I could face military justice or I could volunteer for every dangerous assignment that came up for the next 2 years." Frank's eyes grew hard with the memory. "I spent the next 24 months in some of the worst places on earth, doing jobs that other soldiers wouldn't volunteer for. Bosnia, Somalia, places that didn't officially exist on any map." "That sounds like punishment," Jake observed. "It was, but it was also salvation. Colonel Peterson knew that I needed to prove to myself that I was better than my worst moment. Those 2 years taught me discipline, showed me what I was capable of when I channeled my energy in the right direction." Frank stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty highway. "By the time those 2 years were up, I'd been promoted twice and earned the respect of men who had initially written me off as a thief." "Did you ever see Colonel Peterson again?" Marcus asked. He died in Afghanistan in 2003. But before he deployed, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Frank, everyone deserves a second chance, but very few people deserve a third one." Frank turned back to face them. "This is your second chance, boys. All three of you. But if you waste it, if you end up back here or somewhere worse, you'll have no one to blame but yourselves." The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just charity or pity. "This was a test. What do we have to do?" Marcus asked. Frank smiled grimly. "Everything I tell you to do exactly the way I tell you to do it. And in 6 months, you're going to come back here and tell me how you turned your lives around. And if we don't," Tommy asked, "then I'll make sure Sheriff Martinez gets a very detailed report about tonight's events, complete with your full names and addresses." The carrot and the stick, hope and consequences. Frank had just offered them salvation with very clear terms attached. In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away. The gas station sat alone on Highway 47, its neon lights flickering against the desert darkness. Marcus wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans as he watched the old man behind the counter through the dirty window. This was supposed to be simple. "Get in, grab the cash, get out. No one gets hurt. You sure about this?" whispered Jake, adjusting his baseball cap lower over his eyes. "Place looks dead," Marcus nodded, though his stomach churned with doubt. They'd been planning this for weeks. 3 unemployed friends desperate for quick money, and this isolated gas station seemed like the perfect target. The old man working the night shift looked harmless enough, probably in his 70s, moving slowly as he restocked cigarettes behind the counter. "Remember the plan?" Marcus muttered to his 2 companions. "Jake, you watch the door. Tommy, you grab anything valuable from the shelves. I'll handle the register." Tommy cracked his knuckles nervously. At 19, he was the youngest of the group, barely out of high school with no real job prospects. His mother was sick, medical bills piling up, and his part-time job at the grocery store wasn't cutting it. "What if someone comes in?" "No one's coming out here at midnight," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Look around, man. This place is in the middle of nowhere." Marcus checked his phone. 12:17 a.m., perfect timing. The old man was alone, just like they'd observed for the past 3 nights. No customers had stopped by after 11 p.m. on any of their surveillance runs. The nearest police station was 20 minutes away in the next town. They'd chosen this place carefully. Far from the city, minimal traffic, and run by what appeared to be a single elderly employee who probably wouldn't put up much resistance. Marcus had lost his construction job 6 months ago, when the company downsized. His unemployment benefits had run out and his landlord was threatening eviction. This robbery would solve everything. Or so he told himself. "Masks on," Marcus whispered, pulling a black ski mask over his face. His heart pounded as they approached the glass door. Through the window he could see the old man sitting on a stool behind the counter, reading a paperback book. The man looked peaceful, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The old man glanced up calmly, his gray eyes taking in the 3 masked figures. Instead of fear, there was something else in his expression, a sort of quiet assessment that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Good evening, gentlemen," the old man said in a steady voice, carefully placing a bookmark in his novel. His movements were deliberate, controlled. "Bit late for a snack run, isn't it?" Marcus pulled out the small pistol he'd borrowed from his cousin. His hand shook as he pointed it toward the counter. "This is a robbery. Open the register and give us all the money." The old man studied him with those sharp gray eyes. There was no panic, no trembling, no begging. Instead, he seemed to be evaluating the situation with an unsettling calmness. "You boys picked an interesting place to rob," the old man said, his voice carrying a hint of something Marcus couldn't identify. "You do realize where you are, don't you?" Jake shifted nervously by the door, glancing out at the empty parking lot. Tommy had frozen near the chip rack, suddenly unsure about grabbing merchandise. Something about the old man's demeanor was throwing off their entire plan. "Just give us the money, old-timer," Marcus said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We don't want to hurt you." The old man's lips curved into a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate that, son. But before we go any further, I think there's something you should know about me." He stood up slowly from his stool and Marcus noticed for the first time how the man carried himself. Despite his age, there was a precision to his movements, a coiled readiness that seemed completely at odds with his appearance as a harmless gas station clerk. "The thing is," the old man continued, his voice dropping lower, "I'm not exactly what I appear to be. You see, I spent 32 years in a very particular line of work, and old habits, well, they die hard." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't going according to plan at all. The old man was supposed to be scared, supposed to comply immediately. Instead, he seemed to be taking control of the situation. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, though his voice cracked slightly. The old man's eyes hardened, and suddenly he looked much younger than his 70-something years. "Delta Force, son. Retired 3 years ago. 32 years of service. Most of it in places you can't pronounce, doing things I can't talk about." The temperature in the small gas station seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus felt his confidence evaporating as the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't just some helpless old man they'd chosen to rob. This was something else entirely. "Now then," the old man said, his tone conversational but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "I've got a question for you boys. What's your training? Because right now I'm trying to decide how this evening is going to end." Ing whiskers content and purring in the sun. The silence in the gas station was deafening. Marcus felt the weight of the pistol in his trembling hand as the old man's words sank in. Delta Force, the elite of the elite. The kind of soldiers who appeared in movies and news reports about impossible missions in hostile territory. "You're lying," Marcus said, but his voice betrayed his growing uncertainty. "You're just trying to scare us." The old man, who had introduced himself earlier as Frank according to his name tag, tilted his head slightly. It was a predatory gesture, like a wolf studying prey. "Am I? Let me ask you something, son. How many exits do you see in this store?" Marcus glanced around quickly. "The front door and, there's a back door behind the counter, a window in the storage room that leads to the alley, and an emergency exit behind the beer coolers," Frank said calmly. "You checked the front, but you didn't secure any other exits. First mistake." Jake's head snapped around, suddenly realizing he couldn't see the back of the store from his position by the front door. Tommy remained frozen by the chip rack, his eyes wide behind his mask. "Second mistake," Frank continued. "You announced yourselves the moment you walked in wearing masks at midnight. A professional would have waited, observed, maybe bought something first to gauge the situation." Marcus felt sweat dripping down his back. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. "Just shut up and open the register." Frank's expression didn't change. "Third mistake. Your weapon discipline is terrible. You're holding that pistol like it's going to bite you. Your grip is wrong, your stance is off, and you've been pointing it in my general direction instead of maintaining proper target acquisition." The old man took a step forward, and Marcus instinctively stepped back. "How many rounds you got in that thing, son?" That's not important." "Oh, but it is," Frank said, his voice taking on the tone of an instructor. "Because if you haven't chambered a round, you're holding an expensive paperweight. And if you have chambered one, you're holding a weapon you're clearly not trained to use effectively." Tommy finally found his voice. "Marcus, maybe we should just go." "Nobody's going anywhere until I say so," Frank said firmly, and something in his tone made all 3 young men freeze. "You see, boys, you've put me in what we call a tactical situation. 3 armed individuals have entered my workplace with criminal intent. Now, I could handle this several different ways." Marcus watched in horror as Frank's demeanor shifted completely. The harmless old man disappeared, replaced by someone who moved with fluid precision. Frank's hands, which had seemed shaky moments before, were now steady as rocks. "I could disable all 3 of you in under 10 seconds, Frank said matter-of-factly. "I know 17 different ways to disarm someone with a pistol, 12 of which don't require me to move from behind this counter." "You're bluffing," Jake said from the door, but his voice was high with fear. Frank smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Son, I've disarmed Taliban fighters in caves, cartel members in Colombian jungles, and insurgents in Iraqi safe houses. You think 3 scared kids from suburbia are going to present a challenge?" Marcus felt his world spinning. This was supposed to be easy money, a quick score to solve their problems. Instead, they'd walked into a nightmare. "But here's the thing," Frank continued, his voice softening slightly. "I've also been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. Desperate, broke, feeling like the world has forgotten you exist. He leaned against the counter, suddenly looking more grandfather than commando. I grew up in Detroit in the 70s. My father lost his job at the auto plant when I was 16. I watched him drink himself to death while my mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Marcus found himself listening despite his terror. There was something in Frank's voice now, a humanity that hadn't been there moments before. I enlisted when I was 18 because it was the only way out of poverty I could see. The military gave me purpose, training, a career, but it also gave me skills that most people can't imagine. Frank's eyes moved between the 3 young men. The question now is what we do with this situation. I can see you're not hardened criminals. Your hands are shaking, you keep looking at each other for reassurance, and you picked a target that any experienced thief would avoid. Why would they avoid it? Tommy asked, genuinely curious despite their predicament. Because, son, this gas station is exactly 1.3 miles from Bragg Industries' private security training facility. Half my customers are active or retired military. The other half are local police who know me personally. Marcus felt his knees go weak. They hadn't just picked a random gas station. They'd walked into what amounted to a military outpost. So here's what's going to happen, Frank said, his voice carrying absolute authority. You're going to tell me your real names. You're going to explain why you thought robbing me was a good idea, and then we're going to have a conversation about alternatives to spending the next 10 years in federal prison. Federal prison? Jake squeaked. Robbery of a business that serves a federal contractor facility, Frank explained. That makes this a federal crime, boys. You're not looking at county jail time. Marcus realized with growing horror that they were completely outmatched. This wasn't just about the old man's military training. They'd stumbled into a situation they never could have prepared for. Now, Frank said, who wants to go first? Marcus lowered the pistol, his arm aching from holding it up for so long. The fight had gone out of him completely. Across from him, Frank waited with the patience of someone who had conducted interrogations in much more dangerous circumstances. My name is Marcus Williams, he said finally, pulling off his ski mask. His dark hair was matted with sweat, and his young face showed the strain of their failed robbery attempt. Jake and Tommy followed suit, removing their masks with reluctant resignation. Jake's freckled face was pale with fear, while Tommy looked like he might throw up at any moment. There we go, Frank said approvingly. Much better. Now, Marcus Williams, suppose you tell me why 3 young men thought it was a good idea to rob my store tonight. Marcus set the pistol on the counter, careful to point it away from everyone. We're broke, man. I lost my construction job 6 months ago. Unemployment ran out. My landlord wants me out by Friday if I don't come up with rent money. Frank nodded thoughtfully. And you, Jake? Jake Morrison, the redhead said quietly. My dad's been in the hospital for 2 months, cancer. Mom's working double shifts at the diner, but the insurance doesn't cover everything. We're going to lose the house. Tommy wiped his nose with his sleeve. Tommy Chen. My mom needs surgery, but we can't afford it. I work at Sal's Grocery, but it's only part-time. Minimum wage doesn't even cover her medications. Frank studied each of them carefully. So 3 young men with sick or struggling families decided that armed robbery was the solution to their problems. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Marcus said desperately. We thought it would be quick, easy. No one would get hurt. No one would get hurt, Frank repeated slowly. Son, do you have any idea what you just said? You pointed a loaded weapon at another human being. Even if you had no intention of pulling the trigger, that weapon could have killed me. The weight of their actions seemed to hit Tommy all at once. Oh God, what have we done? Frank walked around the counter, moving with that same fluid precision they'd noticed before. All 3 young men tensed, but he simply picked up Marcus's pistol and expertly checked the chamber. Empty, he announced. Not even a round chambered. Boys, you tried to rob me with an unloaded gun. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment. I couldn't bring myself to load it. Which tells me more about your character than you realize, Frank said, setting the weapon safely aside. Real criminals don't hesitate to load their weapons. Real criminals don't pick targets they feel sorry for. He leaned against the counter, studying them with those sharp gray eyes. Tell me something. How long did you plan this robbery? 3 weeks, Jake admitted. We watched the place, learned your schedule, counted how many customers came by late at night. And in those 3 weeks, did any of you consider legal alternatives? The question hung in the air. Marcus realized how ridiculous they must look. Three desperate young men who had chosen the worst possible solution to their problems. We applied for jobs everywhere, Tommy said defensively. Nobody's hiring or they want experience we don't have. Did you apply for emergency assistance? Food stamps, Medicaid? Did you contact local charities or churches? The silence that followed was answer enough. Frank sighed deeply. Boys, you spent 3 weeks planning a federal crime instead of 3 weeks exploring every legal option available to you. Do you understand how backwards that is? Marcus felt smaller with each word. Everything Frank was saying was true. They'd been so focused on their desperate situation that they'd convinced themselves robbery was their only choice. What happens now? Jake asked quietly. Are you going to call the police? Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying each of their faces. That depends. See, I've got a choice to make here. I can call my buddy Sheriff Martinez, who'll have you in federal custody within an hour, or what? Marcus asked, hope creeping into his voice. Or I can do what my drill sergeant did for me 34 years ago when I was a stupid kid about to make the worst mistake of my life. Frank walked over to the coffee machine and poured himself a cup. Taking his time, the three young men waited in agonizing suspense. I was 18, broke and angry at the world, Frank continued. Got caught trying to steal from a convenience store in Detroit. The owner could have pressed charges, could have ruined my life before it really started. He took a sip of coffee and made a face. This stuff's terrible. Been meaning to replace that machine for months. What did he do? Tommy asked. He gave me a choice. Face the consequences of my actions or find a better way to solve my problems. Then he made a phone call to an army recruiter he knew. Frank set down his coffee cup and looked at each of them in turn. Now, I'm not saying military service is right for all of you, but there are other options. Job training programs, community college with financial aid, apprenticeships with local contractors. Marcus felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. You'd really help us instead of turning us in? I've seen what desperation can do to good people, Frank said. And despite this incredibly stupid decision you made tonight, I can tell you're not bad kids. You're just scared and out of options. He walked over to a bulletin board behind the counter and pulled down several business cards and flyers. These are resources I keep for people in tough situations. Job placement services, emergency assistance programs, medical bill advocates. Why? Jake asked. Why would you help us after what we tried to do? Frank smiled, and for the first time that night it reached his eyes. Because 34 years ago, someone helped a stupid kid named Frank Williams instead of destroying his life. Sometimes paying it forward is the only way to make sense of the good fortune you've been given. The three young men stared at him in amazement. This wasn't how they'd imagined this night ending. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Marcus walked into the gas station with Jake and Tommy beside him. Frank looked up from his paperwork and smiled, a genuine expression of pride that none of them had expected to see. Well, well, Frank said, setting down his pen. Look what the cat dragged in. The three young men had changed dramatically. Marcus had filled out from months of construction work, his hands now permanently stained with calluses and concrete dust. Jake carried himself with new confidence, his face no longer bearing the constant worry that had defined him 6 months earlier. Tommy looked older, more serious, but there was a brightness in his eyes that spoke of purpose found. We brought you something, Tommy said, pulling a card from his jacket pocket. Frank opened it and read silently. Inside was a handwritten thank you note from Tommy's mother, along with a photo of her at home after her successful surgery. The card was signed by all three families. She's doing great, Tommy continued. The doctors say she's responding better than they expected, and she wants to meet you. Frank studied the photo, and for a moment, his tough exterior cracked slightly. That's wonderful, son. There's more, Jake said, pulling out his own envelope. My dad's been cancer-free for 2 months now. The treatment worked, and he wanted me to give you this. Inside was a check made out to the Frank Williams Emergency Fund for $500. What's this about? Frank asked, confused. It's seed money, Marcus explained. We've been talking and we want to do what you did for us. Help other people who get desperate enough to make stupid decisions. Frank set the check down carefully. Boys, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Tommy said. Just tell us if you think it's a good idea. Frank leaned back against the counter, studying the three young men he'd taken a chance on 6 months earlier. They'd not only turned their lives around but had started thinking about helping others do the same. How would it work? He asked. Marcus pulled out a folder thick with papers. We've been researching. There are ways to set up emergency assistance, funds, partner with local businesses for job placement, create support networks for people in crisis. Jake's been working with the medical advocate who helped his family, Tommy added. She's teaching him how to navigate the system so he can help other families. And I'm enrolled in business classes at the community college, Marcus said. Miguel's been teaching me about construction management, but I've also been learning about non-profit organizations. Frank opened Marcus's folder and scanned the documents inside. Business plans, partnership proposals, legal paperwork for establishing a charitable organization. This wasn't just a feel-good idea. They'd done their homework. I'm impressed, Frank said slowly. But running a nonprofit is complicated. It's not just about good intentions. We know, Jake said. That's why we want you to be involved. We need someone with experience, someone people trust, someone who knows how to spot the difference between people who are temporarily desperate and people who are just looking for an easy way out, Tommy added. Frank was quiet for a long moment, processing what they were proposing. Finally, he looked up at them with a serious expression. There's something you boys need to understand before we go any further. What I did for you that night, letting you walk away instead of calling the police, that was a risk, a big one. The three young men exchanged glances. They'd never really considered the risk Frank had taken by trusting them. If you'd screwed up, if you'd gotten arrested for something else or failed to follow through on your commitments, I could have faced serious consequences. Aiding and abetting, obstruction of justice, who knows what else. We never thought about that, Marcus admitted. Of course you didn't. You were thinking like people who needed help, not like people responsible for providing it. But if we're going to do this, if we're going to help other people the way I helped you, we need to be smarter about it. Frank pulled out his own notebook and flipped to a page covered with names and phone numbers. Over the years, I've helped 12 people in situations similar to yours. Some were customers who were struggling, others were referrals from friends. Want to know the success rate? The three young men nodded. 8 out of 12 turned their lives around completely. 2 made significant improvements but still struggle occasionally. And 2, Frank's expression darkened. 2 went right back to making the same bad decisions that got them in trouble in the first place. One of them ended up in prison for armed robbery. The other died of a drug overdose. The weight of that information settled over them like a cold blanket. The point is, Frank continued, helping people is risky business. You're dealing with individuals who are often at the lowest points of their lives, making decisions based on fear and desperation rather than logic and planning. So you think it's a bad idea? Tommy asked, deflated. I think it's a necessary idea, Frank corrected. But it needs to be done right, with proper safeguards, screening processes, and realistic expectations. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the highway where their paths had first crossed. Here's what I propose. We start small, very small. 1 person at a time with extensive follow-up and support. We partner with existing organizations rather than trying to recreate services that already exist. You'll help us? Marcus asked hopefully. Frank turned back to face them. Boys, 6 months ago you tried to rob me with an unloaded gun. Tonight you're proposing to start a charity to help people avoid making the same mistakes you made. If that's not proof that people can change, I don't know what is. He picked up the check from Jake's father. This $500 won't change the world, but it might change one person's life. And if we do this right, that one person might eventually help someone else. Frank's expression grew serious again. But I want you to understand something. This work will be harder than anything you've done so far. You'll meet people who lie to you, manipulate you, and disappoint you. You'll question whether you're making a difference or just enabling bad behavior. How do you handle that? Jake asked. By remembering that for every person who disappoints you, there might be 3 more like yourselves, good people who just need someone to point them in the right direction. Frank smiled at them. Besides, I've got a pretty good track record for spotting the ones worth saving. 2 years later, Frank stood behind the same counter where everything had started. But the gas station looked completely different. What had once been a simple convenience store had become an unofficial community center. A bulletin board near the coffee machine was covered with job postings, resource information, and success stories. A small table in the corner held pamphlets for various assistance programs and business cards for local social workers. The bell above the door chimed, and Marcus walked in wearing a button-down shirt and tie instead of his usual construction clothes. "How'd the meeting go?" Frank asked. Marcus's face broke into a wide grin. "We got the grant. $25,000 from the state to expand the program." Frank felt a surge of pride. The Second Chance Network, as they'd eventually named their organization, had helped 43 people in the past 18 months. Not all success stories. They'd learned to expect setbacks and failures, but enough positive outcomes to prove their approach was working. "Miguel says congratulations, by the way," Marcus continued, "and he wanted me to tell you that 3 of the people we've referred to him are now his best workers." The partnership with Hernandez Construction had been one of their most successful initiatives. Miguel had agreed to interview anyone referred by the Second Chance Network, and his company had become a reliable source of employment for people trying to rebuild their lives. Jake walked in behind Marcus, carrying a stack of papers. He'd been accepted to a social work program at the state university and was spending his summer working full-time with their organization. "Tommy's running late," Jake said. "His mom had a doctor's appointment, but it's just a routine checkup." Tommy had finished his nursing program and was working at the same hospital where his mother had received her surgery. He'd become their specialist in helping families navigate medical crises, using his own experience to guide others through the maze of insurance, charity care, and financial assistance programs. "Any new cases this week?" Frank asked. Jake consulted his papers. 3. A single mother who lost her job and is facing eviction, a veteran with PTSD who's been sleeping in his car, and a teenager whose parents kicked him out for being gay. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Each case would require a different approach, different resources, different levels of intervention. They'd learned that there was no one-size-fits-all solution to human desperation. The mother with the eviction notice. "I know someone who might be able to help," Frank said. "Mrs. Rodriguez runs a nonprofit that specializes in emergency housing assistance." Over the past 2 years, Frank had expanded his network of contacts to include social workers, therapists, job placement specialists, medical advocates, and volunteer lawyers. What had started as a collection of business cards in his notebook had evolved into a comprehensive resource database. The teenager's case would be more complicated. LGBTQ+ youth faced unique challenges that required specialized support services. But Frank had connections in that community too, thanks to a former customer whose son had faced similar circumstances. "What about the veteran?" Marcus asked. "That one might be mine," Frank said quietly. "Military experience creates certain types of trauma that civilians don't always understand." Frank had discovered that his own background made him particularly effective at helping veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. He understood the psychological challenges of leaving a structured, purposeful environment and trying to find meaning in the civilian world. The door chimed again, and Tommy rushed in, slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late. Mom's appointment went longer than expected, but everything's fine." "How's she doing?" Frank asked. "Amazing. The doctors say she's healthier now than she was before the surgery. And she wanted me to invite you all to dinner this Sunday." It had become a tradition. Once a month, the families of the 3 original clients would gather for a meal, sharing updates on their lives and discussing new cases for the Second Chance Network. "Speaking of Sunday dinner," Marcus said, "I have news." He pulled out a small velvet box, and Jake whistled appreciatively. "You're proposing to Sarah?" Tommy asked excitedly. Marcus nodded, his face glowing with happiness. "This weekend. I wanted to tell you guys first, since you're the ones who helped me become the kind of man worth marrying." Frank felt a lump form in his throat. Marcus had met Sarah in one of his business classes at the community college. She was studying to become a teacher, and they'd bonded over their shared desire to help people improve their lives. "That's wonderful, son," Frank said. "She's a lucky woman." "I'm the lucky one," Marcus replied. A few years ago, I was planning to rob gas stations. Now I'm planning to marry a teacher and expand a non-profit organization. If that's not proof that people can change, I don't know what is. As if summoned by their conversation, Frank's phone rang. The caller ID showed Sheriff Martinez's number. "Evening, Sheriff," Frank answered. "What can I do for you?" "Frank, I've got a situation here. 3 kids, early 20s, caught trying to break into the electronics store downtown. First-time offenders, all from families going through hard times." Frank exchanged glances with Marcus, Jake, and Tommy. This had become a regular occurrence. Local law enforcement agencies now called Frank when they encountered young people whose crimes seemed motivated by desperation rather than malice. "What are you thinking?" Frank asked. "Same thing I thought about those 3 boys you helped a couple years back. These kids need guidance, not prison time. You interested in meeting them?" Frank looked at his 3 protégés, all of whom were nodding enthusiastically. "Bring them by the station tomorrow evening around 8, Frank said. "And, Sheriff?" "Make sure they understand this is their one and only chance." After he hung up, Tommy shook his head in amazement. 3 more kids about to make the same mistake we made. The difference is they're going to get caught before they ruin their lives, Jake pointed out. Marcus pulled out a notebook that looked remarkably similar to the one Frank kept behind the counter. "I'll start researching resources for their specific situations tonight," Frank watched his 3 former would-be robbers plan their approach to helping 3 new young people avoid the mistakes they'd almost made. The cycle was continuing, but in the best possible way. "You boys realize what you've become, don't you?" Frank said. "What do you mean?" Tommy asked. "You've become the kind of people who help solve problems instead of creating them, the kind of people who make communities stronger instead of breaking them down." Frank gestured toward the bulletin board covered with success stories and resource information. "This gas station used to be just a place where people bought cigarettes and lottery tickets. Now it's a place where people find hope." As the 4 men began planning their approach to helping 3 new young people find better alternatives to crime, Frank reflected on how much had changed since that night 2 years ago, when 3 desperate young men had walked through his door with a dangerous plan and an unloaded gun. The most important lesson he'd learned wasn't about military training or combat tactics. It was about recognizing that most people are fundamentally good, even when they're making terrible decisions. Sometimes all they need is someone willing to take a risk on their potential, rather than write them off for their mistakes. Outside, the neon lights flickered against the desert darkness just as they had 2 years ago. But inside the gas station, something entirely different was happening. Instead of planning crimes, people were planning solutions. Instead of giving up hope, they were learning to build it. And Frank Williams, retired Delta Force operator turned gas station clerk, turned community guardian, couldn't have been prouder of the legacy he was helping to create. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood outside Hernandez Construction at 6:45 a.m., his hands shaking from nerves rather than desperation this time. He'd gotten the job just as Frank had promised, but keeping it was proving to be the real challenge. Miguel Hernandez was a fair but demanding boss who expected his crew to work hard and learn fast. Marcus had thrown himself into the job with an intensity that surprised even him. Every morning he remembered Frank's words about second chances and worked like his life depended on it. Because it did. His phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Surgery scheduled for next week. Foundation is covering 80% of costs. Can't believe this is real." Marcus smiled as he walked toward the construction site. Tommy had followed through on every contact Frank had given him. The medical billing advocate had found errors in the hospital's charges, reducing the total by 30%. Robert Chen's foundation had agreed to cover most of the remaining costs after Tommy's family applied for assistance. Jake's situation was more complicated. His father's cancer treatment was ongoing, but the family was no longer facing financial ruin. The charity Frank had connected them with had not only helped with immediate expenses, but had also set up a payment plan for future treatments. More importantly, all 3 young men had started attending the weekly meetings Frank had insisted upon. Every Wednesday night at 8 p.m., they met at the gas station after Frank's shift ended. What had started as mandatory check-ins had evolved into something none of them had expected, a support group led by a former Special Forces operator who seemed to understand their struggles better than anyone else. "The thing about desperation," Frank had told them during their second meeting, "is that it makes you stupid. Not permanently stupid, but temporarily incapable of seeing solutions that are right in front of you. He'd been right. In the 3 weeks since their failed robbery attempt, each of them had discovered resources and opportunities they'd never known existed. Marcus's phone rang as he started unloading materials from the truck. It was Frank. "How's the job going, son?" "Good," Marcus said, though he was exhausted. Construction work was harder than anything he'd done before. "Miguel says I'm picking things up faster than most new guys. That's because you're motivated. Fear and gratitude make excellent teachers." Marcus had learned that Frank had a way of cutting straight to the truth, whether it was comfortable or not. "I wanted to let you know," Frank continued. "Tommy's mother's surgery went well yesterday. He called me from the hospital this morning. That's great news." Marcus felt genuine happiness for his former partner in crime. "How's Jake doing?" "Better." His father started responding to the new treatment protocol. Turns out there were clinical trials available that their original doctor hadn't mentioned. Marcus shook his head in amazement. A month ago, all three of them had been convinced that crime was their only option. Now they were discovering that the world was full of people willing to help if you knew how to ask. "Frank, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Why did you really help us that night?" "I mean, the real reason." There was a long pause. Marcus could hear the familiar sounds of the gas station in the background, the coffee machine gurgling, the bell above the door chiming as a customer entered. "You want the truth?" Frank said finally. "Yeah, because I saw myself 34 years ago, angry, desperate, convinced that the world owed me something. And because I've learned that most people who end up in bad situations aren't bad people. They're just people who ran out of good options. Or thought they did," Marcus said. "Exactly. The difference between a criminal and a citizen is often just information and opportunity." Marcus understood what Frank meant. They'd spent weeks planning a robbery instead of weeks researching assistance programs. They'd been so focused on their problems that they'd missed the solutions. "There's something else," Frank said. "I want you boys to start thinking about the next phase." "Next phase?" "You've proven you can follow directions and work hard. Now I want to see if you can think bigger. Miguel tells me you've been asking good questions about the business side of construction." Marcus had been curious about how construction projects were planned and managed. Miguel had started explaining the bidding process, project management, and client relations during their lunch breaks. "I've been thinking about maybe taking some business classes at the community college," Marcus admitted. "Good. Jake's been talking about becoming a medical advocate himself, helping other families navigate the system, and Tommy's considering nursing school." "Really? Really? See, boys, this is what happens when you stop thinking like victims and start thinking like people who can solve problems." Frank's voice took on that instructional tone Marcus had become familiar with. "Every Wednesday for the past month I've been watching you three transform. Not just your circumstances, but your mindset." "It feels different," Marcus said. "I used to wake up every morning feeling hopeless. Now I wake up with things to do, goals to work toward. That's called purpose, son. It's what separates humans from animals. We need something to work toward, something that matters." Miguel waved at Marcus from across the job site, pointing at his watch. "Time to get to work. I've got to go," Marcus said. "But Frank?" "Thank you for everything. Don't thank me yet. You boys still have a long way to go. But I will say this, you're exceeding my expectations." As Marcus hung up and headed toward his crew, he thought about how different his life was now compared to a month ago. The same problems that had seemed insurmountable were either solved or manageable. The difference was that he now had help, information, and most importantly, hope. But he also knew that Frank was right. This was just the beginning. Staying on the right path would require the same dedication they'd once put into planning crimes, except channeled toward building something instead of destroying it.